You hear them before you see them, the rhythmic splash of oars cutting through morning mist. Your husband's blood still warm on the monastery steps, his axe fallen beside him. You clutch your daughter close, feeling her heartbeat against yours as the longships beach on the shore. The raiders aren't coming for gold or silver anymore. They've already taken that. Now they're coming for you, and what happens next won't end with your death. Death would be merciful. What the Vikings have planned will last generations. Between 793 and 1066, Viking raids terrorized Europe from Lindisfarne to Constantinople. We know about the warriors who fell defending their homes. We know about the monasteries burned, the gold stolen. But there's a darker truth hidden in archaeological soil samples and slave market ledgers. What happened to the wives and daughters of defeated warriors has been deliberately omitted from most historical accounts. The evidence survived anyway, in mass grave, in DNA patterns, in chains sized for women's wrists found at Dublin's Wood Quay. If you're interested in the documented but rarely discussed aspects of Viking history, make sure to subscribe. This research draws from eyewitness accounts, the law codes, and recent archaeological discoveries. Let us know in the comments which historical period you'd like us to explore next. The monastery fell in 841. The Irish annals record 600 warriors dead, but they fall silent about the 800 women who vanished that day. We only know because of the excavations at Dublin's slave markets, iron shackles fitted precisely for female wrists, ankle rings small enough for children as young as 5. This wasn't random violence, it was industrial. Viking Dublin wasn't just a trading post. Between 841 and 970, dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, reveals continuous expansion of the harbor, not for fishing boats, for slave ships. The largest warehouse could hold 200 human beings. Drainage channels were carved into stone floors, not for rainwater, for human waste. These women spent weeks, sometimes months, in these holding pens. The economics were precise. Runic inscriptions at Schleswig list prices: 20 silver marks for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 if she was injured during capture. Arabic chronicler documented Viking slave caravans reaching Baghdad by 913. Pale-skinned Celtic and Germanic women fetched premium prices as exotic commodities. One ship manifest, carved in runes, lists 20 head of woman cattle from Ireland. But here's what the sagas won't tell you: capture was sometimes the best outcome. In 865, when the great heathen army took York, soil analysis reveals something horrifying. In the settlement center stood a building with 64 individual cells. For 40 years, this facility operated openly. The church baptismal records list 732 births from this location. Only 12 children survived past age 5. This wasn't a prison, it was a breeding facility. The Iceland's medieval law code spelled out the rules. When a warrior killed another in battle, the dead man's wife became owned woman. The killer had 3 days to claim her publicly before witnesses. Her consent was never mentioned because it was never required. If she took her own life to escape, her captor could demand compensation from her family. Suicide wasn't escape, it was theft of property. The fine was 40 silver marks. The marriage ceremonies were legal under Norse law. Any children born were legitimate. The systematic rape wasn't just tolerated, it was. Contemporary accounts describe the ritual. The woman was brought before the assembly, her captor declared ownership, witnesses confirmed, and she became his property. Not his servant, his wife, with all the legal rights of a purchased cow. Archaeological evidence proves this system's scope. In 873–874, the Great Army wintered there. We found 249 skeletons. Only 63 were adult women. Isotope analysis reveals these weren't local women. They were captives from Ireland, Scotland, Wales. But where were the rest? Women don't simply vanish unless they're taken. The answer lies in the slave routes stretching from Dublin to Constantinople. By 907, when the Great Army wintered the system had evolved. Excavations uncovered something that chronicles never mention: portable breeding pens in the baggage trains, iron frameworks that could hold a dozen adults or 20 children, modular sections for quick assembly, chains sized specifically for pregnant women. This wasn't the chaos of war. This was infrastructure. The main eastern slave route stretched over 1,000 miles from Novgorod to Kiev along the Dnieper River. The Byzantine Treaty of 944 lists slave prices by category: young women, highest price; pregnant women, discounted; children under 10, nearly worthless. By 950, this wasn't human trafficking. It was an established commodity market with futures contracts and delivery schedules. Witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga in 921. He describes the ritual murder of a slave girl at her master's burial. She was drugged with henbane, raped by 6 warriors, then strangled while a priestess called the Angel of Death drove a dagger between her ribs. Boat burials across Scandinavia contain female skeletons with identical strangulation marks and drug residues in their teeth. This wasn't one incident. It was standard practice. The scale becomes clear through genetics. Modern DNA studies reveal the truth. 60% of Iceland's female ancestry traces to Celtic women. In Norway, 40% comes from the British Isles. These weren't willing migrants. Mitochondrial DNA tells us these were captive women, taken between 850 and 950, forced into pregnancy, their children raised as Vikings. Behind those percentages are tens of thousands of erased lives. Maritime archaeology adds another dimension. A shipwreck dated to 912 contained specialized holds, ventilation shafts, water storage for weeks at sea, reinforced compartments for human cargo. It could carry 80 women below deck. Burn marks show it sank in a storm. All 80 women, chained in the hold, drowned. The Vikings who survived made no attempt to free them. Resistance meant something worse than death. Outside Dublin's walls, archaeologists found punishment pits, stone-lined holes 6 feet deep, 3 feet across. Too small to lie down, too shallow to stand. Inside were women's skeletons with legs deliberately broken to prevent escape, arms shattered to prevent suicide. They weren't killed. They were left to die over days, sometimes weeks. Viking law was explicit. Any slave woman who harmed her master was buried alive, but never quickly. Soil analysis shows decomposition patterns indicating prolonged death from thirst, cold, exposure. Some pits contained sharp stones to tear flesh. Others had standing water deep enough to cause slow drowning, but shallow enough to prolong agony. Captives were forced to watch these executions, learning the price of defiance. The most disturbing evidence comes from in Sweden. A mass grave of 23 women, all showing defensive wounds, broken forearms from protecting themselves, skull fractures from behind. But these weren't battle casualties. Forensic analysis shows they died days after capture. The pattern of injuries indicates systematic interrogation. They were tortured for information about hidden valuables, then executed when no longer useful. In 914, Irish forces retook Dublin. The annals celebrate the Viking defeat. They don't mention what was found in the punishment grounds, 17 women still alive in the pits, too damaged to save. The Irish chronicler wrote only, "Mercy was granted." Archaeological evidence suggests this meant a quick death rather than continued suffering. Here's what medieval chronicles deliberately omitted. The Christian Church was complicit. York Minster's account books list regular payments to the breeding facility operators, not bribes, contracted fees. When Vikings converted to Christianity, the slavery infrastructure wasn't dismantled. It was rebranded. Slaves became indentured servants. The chains remained the same. Baptismal records across England show a pattern after 1000 CE. Thousands of children labeled foundlings of unknown parentage, all born to enslaved women, all sold into church servitude. The prophets funded cathedral construction. Canterbury Cathedral's foundation stones were literally paid for with human trafficking proceeds. Church documents list these transactions as redemption fees. By 1066, when William conquered England, the system was so entrenched that Norman knights expected captured Saxon women as part of their land grants. The Domesday Book records women alongside cattle, and not as people but as chattel. Marriage was the legal mechanism that transformed rape into property transfer. Saxon heiresses were systematically forced to marry Norman knights to legitimize land seizures. The Church blessed these unions. Contemporary accounts call it civilizing the Saxon bloodline. The suicide rate among noble Saxon women tripled after. Convents saw a 300% increase in women seeking sanctuary. Many were later dragged out and forcibly married anyway. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself performed some of these ceremonies. The children born from these systematic rapes faced their own horrors. Viking law was clear. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. If the child couldn't work, the child was eliminated. Excavations at Dublin found infant bones in refuse pits, dozens showing blunt force trauma, not stillbirths, murders. The economics were simple. Feeding a child who couldn't contribute was considered waste. In York, archaeologists discovered something worse. A pit filled with children's skeletons aged 5 to 10. Bone analysis revealed they died from mercury poisoning administered slowly over months. Why? These were the children who showed defiance, who remembered their mother's languages, who wouldn't assimilate. They were systematically poisoned to madness, their testimonies discredited before death. The psychological warfare extended to mothers. Women were often forced to choose which child would live and which would die. Rune stones describe this as testing their motherly virtue. Those who refused to choose watched all their children killed. Those who chose carried that trauma forever. Skeletal analysis shows many of these women died by suicide within months of these forced choices. But some women found ways to resist. Bone analysis reveals deliberate malnutrition patterns in pregnant captives. They were starving themselves to cause miscarriages. Others ingested herbs known to cause birth defects. Their children couldn't be sold or used. The Vikings responded by force-feeding pregnant captives, chaining them during pregnancy to prevent self-harm. Not all women remained victims. The Frankish chronicles mention a freed Norse captive who spent 7 years hunting Vikings. She knew their tactics, their fears, their weaknesses. Between 923 and 930, she destroyed 12 Viking camps. Her method was always the same: surprise attacks targeting slave markets, no prisoners taken. Contemporary accounts say she castrated slavers before killing them, 47 documented deaths. Archaeological evidence supports her campaign. Burn layers at Viking sites along the same date precisely to this period. Someone was systematically destroying slaving infrastructure. Someone who knew exactly where to strike. Vanishes from records after 930, but the burn patterns continue for another decade. She had trained others. In Ireland, a woman known only as Dark led escaped slaves in raids against Viking settlements. The annals of Ulster mention her only once, noting she freed 200 captives from Dublin's markets in 953. Excavations show the market was rebuilt with higher walls and better afterward. They feared organized resistance from their victims. The most successful resistance came from within Viking society itself. Norse women who had witnessed the system's horrors sometimes helped captives escape. Rune stones occasionally mention women executed for betraying the household. Archaeological context suggests this meant freeing slaves. One stone from reeds died for mercy's sake. Her kindness was her crime. The mass grave tells the darkest story of all. Initial excavations found 264 bodies, all female, dating to 986. But these weren't captured enemies. Isotope analysis proved they were Norse-born women. When Viking power in England collapsed, the raiders knew exactly what awaited their own families if captured. They had inflicted it for generations, so they turned those same methods inward. The killings took several days. Soil analysis shows systematic execution, mothers and daughters killed together to leave no witnesses. Some were poisoned with mercury to drive them mad first, discrediting any potential testimony. Others show signs of strangulation, the same method used in funeral sacrifices. They were killing their own families using the exact techniques they'd perfected on captives. One skull bears a runic inscription, "Better this way," carved after death into the bone of a girl no older than 14. Someone paused during this massacre to justify their actions, to explain why this Norse child, born in Norway, raised in England, had to die by her own father's hand, because he knew what enemy warriors would do to her. He had done it himself to others. But's grave held one more secret. Recent soil core analysis revealed it wasn't a single event. The grave contains multiple layers spanning 50 years. This wasn't one desperate act. It was policy. Whenever Viking settlements fell, the women were eliminated, not by enemies, by their own people. Generation after generation of Norse women were silenced, their stories erased, their existence denied. Modern DNA tells us the scale of this hidden Holocaust. Population genetics reveals massive demographic shifts exactly aligning with Viking slave roots. Y chromosome analysis shows Norse male lineages spreading across Europe, but mitochondrial DNA passed through mothers tells a different story. Celtic and Saxon female lines appear in Scandinavia in massive numbers starting in 850 CE. In Iceland, the genetic evidence is undeniable. The country was settled primarily by Norse men and Celtic women, not Norse families, Norse men and their captives. The founding population was approximately 80% Norse men and 60% Celtic women. Those numbers represent thousands of women taken from Ireland and Scotland, shipped to Iceland, and forced to bear children for their captors. The Orkney Islands show even starker patterns. Pre-Viking, the population was entirely Pictish. By 1000 CE, male lineages were 90% Norse, female lineages remained 90% Pictish. The men had been killed. The women had been claimed. An entire people erased except for mitochondrial DNA, the ghost in the genetic code that testifies to systematic rape on a societal scale. These patterns repeat everywhere Vikings settled. The Hebrides, the Isle of Man, coastal Ireland, northern England, always the same genetic signature. Norse men, local women, and a silence in the historical record about how those pairings occurred. But bones don't lie. DNA doesn't forget. Every double helix carries testimony that chronicles tried to erase. When the Viking Age ended, the infrastructure remained. The Normans themselves descended from Vikings inherited and expanded the system. After in 1066, William's conquest included systematic sexual violence as policy. The Domesday Book lists Saxon women as property to be distributed. Norman castles were built with holding cells specifically designed for women. Archaeological surveys of Norman castles reveal the pattern: courtyards with cells for 30 women, stone walls, iron doors, no windows, refuse pits containing infant bones, mortality rates approaching 100%. These weren't accidents of medieval medicine. Barbies born to Saxon mothers and Norman fathers were often eliminated to remove evidence of rape. The legitimate heirs were kept. The bastards were discarded. By 1086, 20 years after the conquest, Saxon noble bloodlines had effectively vanished from male records but persisted in female lines. The women survived as forced wives, their children raised as Normans. Genetic analysis of medieval cemeteries shows this transformation: Saxon mitochondrial DNA persisting while Saxon Y chromosomes disappeared. An entire aristocracy erased through systematic sexual violence. The last Anglo-Saxon chronicle entry from Peterborough in 1154 contains a curious line: "The old women remember what we dare not write." Historians long wondered what this meant. Archaeological evidence now suggests they remembered the breeding, the forced marriages, the systematic elimination of Saxon identity through rape and controlled reproduction. They remembered but couldn't record it. The Normans would have killed them. For 300 years, from 793 to 1066, this system operated across Europe. Tens of thousands of women vanished into slavery, forced marriage, and breeding. Their stories were deliberately erased from chronicles written by the very men who victimized them. Sagas celebrated the warriors but silenced their victims. Chronicles recorded battles but omitted what came after. But evidence survives where historians tried to hide it: in soil samples showing decomposition patterns, in bone fragments revealing violence patterns, in DNA carrying testimonies written in nucleotides, in chains sized for women's wrists and children's ankles, in punishment pits designed for slow death, in breeding facilities operating in city centers. The infrastructure was too vast to completely erase. This history matters because it reveals how systematic dehumanization operates, how violence becomes infrastructure, how law legitimizes atrocity, how economics drives exploitation, how silence enables continuation. The Vikings weren't uniquely evil, they were uniquely documented in their systematic approach. The same patterns appear wherever one group declares another as property. Modern trafficking networks follow identical patterns: infrastructure disguised as legitimate business, legal frameworks that enable exploitation, economic incentives that perpetuate abuse, and deliberate silence about victim experiences. The Viking slave trade ended not because humanity evolved, but because economic systems changed. The capacity for such systematic horror remains coded in our social DNA. The women whose bones fill mass grave from Dublin to York to had names, families, stories. They loved their children even when those children were forced upon them. They found ways to resist even when resistance meant death. They maintained humanity in conditions designed to erase it. Their mitochondrial DNA lives on in millions of descendants who don't know their stories. History isn't just written by the victors, it's written by the Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, but the women they destroyed remain voiceless except through archaeology and genetics. Every excavation that uncovers chains sized for female wrists, every DNA study that reveals forced population replacement, every soil sample showing systematic killing, these are testimonies that refuse to stay buried. The bones speak what the chronicles silenced. And what they say is this: what Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors wasn't just worse than death. It was a systematic erasure of human identity that continued for centuries, involved entire societies, and left genetic scars that persist to this day. The real horror isn't what we've discovered, it's what we've chosen to forget.